So, the introduction of broadcasting to Ireland, which comes within a couple of years of the establishment of the BBC in the UK. And to a certain extent, we can understand Irish broadcasting by both comparing and contrasting the manner in which 2RN, the first Irish broadcaster, is established in 1926. But it does take a couple of years. So the Irish Free State comes into existence at the end of 1921. And so in 1922, when the Free State is still basically establishing itself, this is the moment at which in the UK, the British Postmaster General was trying to deal with, tens, if not hundreds of applications from wireless set manufacturers looking for a license to set up a radio service. And this is in the wake of the Dame Nellie Melba broadcast. And of course, what those wireless set manufacturers in the UK are looking for is to create a broadcasting service to encourage people to go out and buy radio sets. Within 6 months of the establishment of the Irish state, a number of radio set manufacturers, including the Marconi Company, had applied for a license to erect a transmitter in Dublin and to operate a Dublin broadcasting station. Marconi, for example, offered to create and operate an efficient and, their words, adequate service of music, speeches, songs and news in return for the exclusive right to broadcast into the 26 counties. But the Irish Postmaster General was suspicious that the Marconi Company's interest in operating a broadcasting station wouldn't long last after they had basically sold as many radio sets as they possibly could within Ireland. So he decided basically to wait. His name is J.J. Walsh. He decided to wait and see basically how the British experiment with establishing a new station panned out. In any case, the fact of the Civil War, which begins in April 1922 and continues until May 1923, meant that it was basically illegal to own a wireless telegraphy set or a radio set during that period. The model of the BBC, when it began broadcasting in autumn 1922, appealed very much to J.J. Walsh, the Irish Postmaster General. And so what he began to think about was the establishment of a single Irish broadcaster, like the BBC, one broadcaster, in which every Irish manufacturer of wireless apparatus or radio sets would have a stake, again, like the BBC, so an Irish broadcasting company. They had contemplated the idea of a directly Department of Post and Telegraphs run service, but Walsh's assumption was that broadcasting was going to be for entertainment, and this was something that was basically too trivial for a public service to be operating. So in April 1923, Walsh invited proposals from private companies to set up an Irish broadcasting company. Now, by this stage, the Marconi Company's experiences with setting up the BBC and the difficulties with its finances led the Marconi Company to reject the idea of setting up an Irish equivalent. And even though there weren't any other significant wireless set manufacturers based in Ireland, nonetheless, a sort of consortium of entrepreneurs came forward, led by a London-based businessman, but I think of Irish extraction, called Andrew Belton. And what they were proposing was essentially an Irish broadcasting company. And discussions began between the IBC and the Post Office as to what this service might look like, what kind of content it might have, how it might be financed, what kind of broadcasting hours it might do, etc., etc. And the result of those discussions informed a white paper that J.J. Walsh laid before the Irish Dáil in November 1923. Walsh appeared to assume that the Dáil would simply accept this white paper without demur, because broadcasting wasn't, much of an issue of public controversy at the time. The fact of the Civil War meant that there wasn't a particularly powerful public lobby in favour or of any particular form of broadcasting. Nonetheless, in December 1923, the Cumann na Gael deputy TD Darrell Figgis laid his own proposal before the Dáil that a special committee on the future of broadcasting should be set up, and this was accepted. And for 3 months in 1924, you have the operation of the Dáil Special Committee on broadcasting. Much of the testimony that the Dáil Special Committee heard basically supported the idea of an IBC. the IBC itself, or the entrepreneurs who would form it, were amongst the people who were addressing the special committee. You also had the Radio Association of Ireland. This was a group of professionals and amateurs that had come together after the Civil War had ended in 1923. They basically argued that the kind of red tape that would be associated with a state-run service would mean that the service would lack the sympathy it needed to basically create programming that would be appealing to people. So they also recommended, or were in favour of, I suppose, the establishment of a private company, albeit one that would be regulated by the state. However, the Special Dáil Committee reached the conclusion that any IBC that is privately run broadcasting service would be inappropriate. This was in part driven by a political scandal which emerged in the course of the Dáil Committee's deliberations. It emerged that Darrell Figgis, the Cumann na Gael TD who had essentially set up the committee in the first place, and Andrew Belton, the entrepreneur who was leading the IBC proposal, had a previous business relationship which had ended, I think, in August 2023, whereby Andrew Belton had advanced money to, I won't say bribe, but we're in that territory, had advanced money to Darrell Figgis on the understanding that this would improve Belton's chances of securing contracts from the Irish state for the development or the redevelopment of the war-battered Irish state. The relationship appears to have ended quite badly in August 1923, and it appears that part of Figgis's motivation for proposing the establishment of the committee on broadcasting back in December 1923 was an intention to scupper basically Belton's chances of operating an Irish broadcasting company. The final committee report then recommended that broadcasting should be a purely state service, that the establishment of a distribution network for broadcasting signals and the operation of a broadcasting station should be solely in the hands of the state. If for some reason this was impossible, then the next best solution was to have it run by a company in which the state had a controlling interest. The committee based its recommendations on its perception of the potential that radio had for education, for agriculture, for the development of industry and commerce, etc., etc. It saw broadcasting, in some respects in kind of Reithian terms, as having the potential to promote, for example, the revival of the national language, and indeed the acquisition of other languages, for promoting principles of hygiene, gardening, beekeeping, etc., etc. Basically, it saw broadcasting as having an enormous educational potential for the new state. And even though it acknowledged the new medium's potential for entertainment, it argued that such uses were, and I quote, of vastly less importance than its potential to minister to cultural and commercial progress. And in this, it was able to cite arguments that had been put forward during the Special Dáil Committee's hearings by J.J. Walsh himself. Because Walsh had suggested that an Irish-based broadcaster would contribute to the development of an independent Ireland. Independent in the sense of an independent thinking and self-supporting nation. Walsh had also stressed the potential contribution of such a station to the spread of the Irish language. Yet, ironically, of course, Walsh was advancing such arguments in support of an IBC private company style broadcasting service. And when when responsibility basically for running the new service was passed to his department, to the Department of Posts and Telegraphs, by the committee, his enthusiasm for the whole idea diminished significantly. And in part, this was because of a recognition that financing this was going to be incredibly difficult. At a time when the nation was, experiencing severe austerity, Walsh knew it was going to be very hard to convince the Department of Finance to hand over the kind of revenues that would make it possible to run the service on any kind of meaningful basis. I think the conclusions reached by the committee are interesting in the extent to which they diverge from using or subscribing to the British model. And I think it's important to think about the contrasting political situations Britain and Ireland found themselves in the 1920s. In the UK, you have a politically stable state with an established sense of national identity. And here, the BBC is allowed to be relatively independent because that state doesn't need a broadcaster to basically underpin its existence. And thus, for example, there's no real problem in allowing the BBC, at least initially, to be a private company, as it was for the first 5 years of its existence. In Ireland, however, you have a brand new state seeking to establish itself, and a state which almost immediately gets into literally a civil war, over a dispute about what that new state meant. And in that context, perhaps it's not that surprising that the new state sought to control radio as a potentially very powerful means of education and of communicating ideas, I suppose, about the way the new state could be organised. So therefore, I think broadcasting was particularly seen as too important to be left in the hands of private broadcasters, and hence the direct state control of the service. And there was a great deal of faith in the capacity of the new broadcasting service to create a new national identity, one which defined Irishness not simply in terms of not being British, but rather which created a new sense of Irishness, one which defined Irishness in terms of its own terms of reference. In practice, the implementation of the committee's recommendations was quite slow. The Post Office were reluctant to take on the service because they were worried, correctly as it turned out, the Department of Finance were going to be reluctant to hand over the funding that was going to be necessary to operate it. So in fact, it's not until January 1926, so it's at least 18 months before the new service, 2RN, goes on air. It was originally based in a small studio on Little Denmark Street, which no longer exists. It's now been subsumed into what became the Alex Centre. But in a small studio basically off Dublin's Henry Street. And it transmitted via a low-power 1.5 kilowatt transmitter that was based in the McKee Army Barracks in the Phoenix Park. In October 1928, the studios would move basically across the road, across Henry Street, into purpose-built studios in the Henry Street side of the GPO. And the radio service actually would remain there until at least the 1960s, even after a new building and broadcasting service centre had been built in Montrose out in Donnybrook in Dublin 4. One of the odd things about the establishment of 2RN is that its establishment precedes the legislation which makes it legally possible. So 2RN goes on air in January 1926, but the Wireless Telegraphy Act, which creates a legal context for it, wasn't passed until November 1926. So even though licenses are being issued for the ownership of radio sets, actually from 1923 onwards, it's not until November 1926 that you could actually legally pursue someone through the courts for not having a license, for not paying basically their license fee. The main intention of the Wireless Telegraphy Act isn't even focused on broadcasting. It's more about regulating radio as a point-to-point communications device and basically replacing Irish legislation or replacing British legislation with new Irish legislation. To the extent that it talks about broadcasting at all, its key function is to reserve to the Minister for Posts and Telegraphs the sole right to license the operation of broadcasting services within Ireland. And of course it remains the case that up until the 1980s, state-run broadcaster, the state-owned broadcaster, was the only legal broadcaster operating within the 26 counties. Even if well before that you had broadcasts coming into Ireland from outside, from the BBC, from radio, from Belfast in the 1920s, then television in the 1930s, and then from companies like ITV in the 1950s. The Act didn't assume, however, that the Minister would necessarily run the service entirely by themselves. Section 19 of the Act made provision for the creation of a Broadcasting Advisory Committee, which was there to advise the Minister on the conduct of the broadcasting stations. But in point of fact, it's not until 1944 that any minister actually avails of that and establishes a Broadcasting Advisory Committee. So you've got extraordinary centralisation of power and authority, certainly during the first 2 decades and arguably the first 4 decades of broadcasting in Ireland. It's crucial to emphasise this point. In the UK, broadcasting after 1927 is placed in the hands of a national institution, so a public broadcasting corporation, the BBC. And so it's run by public servants who are not in the direct employ of the state. It is therefore at something of an arm's length remove from state control. In Ireland, by contrast, if you worked in 2RN, or what would become Radio Éireann in the 1930s, you were a civil servant and you were directly employed by the Department of Posts and Telegraphs. So there's a much more direct, if you like, line of control, line of hierarchical authority from the state over the operation of the broadcasting service in the 20s and 30s and 40s. And this is reflected, as we'll see, in the kind of content that we see. I suppose, in particular, what it meant was there was very little space for content or for programming which is critical of the state for really the first 30 or 40 years of broadcasting's existence in Ireland.